A few years ago, I made a decision that completely changed my life. I left behind the endless traffic, crowded streets, blaring sirens, and sleepless nights of the city, and moved to a tiny rural community hidden deep among endless forests and towering mountains. I had never been the kind of person who enjoyed city life. The constant noise slowly wears you down without you even realizing it. Every day felt like a race against thousands of strangers. Eventually, I reached a point where I simply couldn't take it anymore. The moment I had saved enough money to support myself, I packed everything I owned into my old pickup truck and disappeared into the countryside. The town I chose was almost forgotten by the outside world. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. There were no traffic lights, no shopping malls, no skyscrapers, just a handful of weathered buildings sitting quietly beneath an endless sky. There were only a few restaurants, 2 small bars, a gas station that doubled as the town's repair shop, 1 modest grocery store, and a tiny police station that rarely seemed busy. If you wanted anything more exciting than that, you'd have to drive nearly an hour to the nearest Walmart. Most people would probably call it boring. To me, it felt like paradise. Every season transformed the surrounding wilderness into something breathtaking. Spring painted the valleys in bright green. Summer filled the woods with birdsong and the scent of pine. Autumn turned the mountains into oceans of gold, crimson, amber. Even winter, cold and unforgiving, carried a haunting beauty that made the entire landscape look untouched by time. I could never understand why tourists hadn't completely overrun the place. Perhaps it was simply too isolated. Perhaps people preferred comfort over silence. Whatever the reason, I secretly hoped it would stay that way forever. I've now lived there for more than 3 years. For almost every one of those days, life was exactly what I had dreamed it would be. Almost. Because every peaceful place seems to hide something that refuses to stay buried. Sometimes that secret isn't an abandoned building. Sometimes it wears a human face. Soon after arriving, I found a part-time job at the local grocery store. Before moving, I had managed one of the largest supermarket chains back in my hometown, so the owner hired me almost immediately. Every morning, I arrived before sunrise. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs as I unloaded delivery trucks beneath the pale glow of security lights. I stocked shelves, organized inventory, and helped prepare the store before the first customers wandered in. The owner repeatedly tried convincing me to become the store manager. I politely refused every time. Money wasn't why I had moved here. I already earned enough through my online work. This job was simply an excuse to meet people and keep myself active. More importantly, working only part-time meant I had countless hours to disappear into the wilderness. Hiking became an obsession. Fishing became therapy. The forests surrounding the town stretched farther than maps could properly capture. Hidden trails branched into forgotten valleys, winding rivers, abandoned logging roads, and mountains that seemed untouched by civilization. I often joked to myself that I'd need several lifetimes to explore every corner of those woods. I intended to try anyway. Rain or sunshine didn't matter. Every day off, I packed my backpack before sunrise and wandered somewhere completely new. Those forests quickly became my second home. The people in town made settling in even easier. Nearly everyone greeted me with genuine smiles. Conversations felt effortless. Neighbors waved from their porches. Strangers remembered my name after meeting me only once. Everyone was welcoming. Everyone except one man. His name was Hector. Calling Hector strange would be an incredible understatement. He wasn't rude. He wasn't violent. He wasn't aggressive. He simply existed in a way that made every instinct in your body whisper that something wasn't right. The first time I met him remains burned into my memory. It was around 5 o'clock one freezing morning. The parking lot outside the grocery store was completely empty except for my truck. As I stepped out and locked the driver's door, someone suddenly rushed toward me. Before I could react, a weathered face appeared only inches from mine. Hector. My heart nearly exploded. Growing up in the city had conditioned me to expect the worst whenever someone invaded my personal space that quickly. My hands shot upward instinctively, ready to defend myself. Instead of attacking, he screamed. Not words. Just a long, high-pitched scream directly into my face. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he smiled, turned around, and skipped away. Actually skipped. Like a carefree child crossing a playground. I stood frozen beside my truck, trying to process what had just happened. One of my coworkers walked over, barely reacting. "Oh, that's just Hector," he laughed. "Don't worry. He's harmless." Harmless. That was the word everyone used. Apparently, Hector had wandered around town for years. Nobody knew exactly where he lived. Some believed he slept beneath one of the old bridges outside town. Others claimed he camped somewhere deep inside the mountains. No one really knew. No one ever asked. People simply accepted him as another part of the town, like the old church or the abandoned grain silo. After hearing the same explanation from nearly everyone, I decided not to think much about it. But Hector seemed to appear everywhere. Morning, afternoon, late at night, leaving work before sunrise, walking home after the bars closed, stopping for gas, buying groceries. There he was, always wandering, always skipping. His appearance never changed. He couldn't have stood taller than 5'3", yet his shoulders were unbelievably broad. He looked compact but incredibly powerful, built like someone who had spent decades chopping trees with nothing but an axe. His clothes never seemed to change either. A stained white tank top, faded royal blue pants that were impossible to identify as jeans or sweatpants, long gray beard, thin ponytail hanging behind a bald scalp. The image alone was unsettling, but what disturbed everyone most wasn't how he looked. It was how happy he seemed. He skipped everywhere with an innocent smile that somehow felt completely disconnected from reality, as if he were living inside a world only he could see. One morning while driving to work before dawn, I noticed Hector standing alone at an empty intersection. He was facing away from the road, one arm lifted high, slowly waving. At first I assumed someone stood just beyond my view, but as I drove closer, there was nobody. No parked car, no pedestrian, no cyclist. Nothing, just empty pavement disappearing into darkness. Yet Hector continued waving enthusiastically. Then he began speaking, laughing, nodding, pausing as though listening carefully to someone answering him. His conversation seemed perfectly natural, except he was completely alone. I shrugged it off. People suffering from severe mental illness sometimes speak aloud to themselves. As long as he wasn't hurting anyone, it wasn't really my concern. Or so I believed. Everything changed one weekend. It was my day off, and I decided to explore an untouched section of forest several miles outside town. The farther I hiked, the quieter everything became. Even the birds seemed absent. Only the wind whispered through towering pines. Hours passed. I had wandered so deep into the wilderness that there were no trails left to follow. And that's when I heard it. Voices. Faint at first, echoing somewhere ahead. Every survival instinct immediately told me something was wrong. People simply didn't wander this far into the forest. Not around here. Yet the voices continued. One sounded furious. Another sounded terrified. Someone seemed to be pleading. Another interrupted with cruel insults. It sounded like multiple people arguing. My heartbeat accelerated. Someone might actually need help. I quietly pulled my folding knife from my pocket, not because I expected a fight, but because being completely unarmed suddenly felt like an incredibly bad idea. Step by careful step, I crept toward the voices. Branches cracked softly beneath my boots, despite every effort to stay silent. The arguments grew louder, angrier. Then, suddenly, someone began crying. Not ordinary crying. Gut-wrenching sobs filled with absolute despair. The kind of crying that makes your stomach tighten. The voices were just beyond a thick wall of trees. Holding my breath, I slowly leaned around the trunk to look. What I saw made every hair on my body stand up. There wasn't a group of people. There wasn't anyone arguing. There was only Hector, standing completely alone. His back was partially turned toward me. 1 second, he shouted in a deep, furious voice unlike anything I'd ever heard. "You worthless coward." A heartbeat later, his entire posture collapsed. His shoulders trembled. His voice transformed into something fragile, broken, almost childlike. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I didn't mean to." Then another transformation. A cold, mocking laugh. Then another voice. Older. Then another. Female. Then another. Each personality arrived instantly, as though invisible people were taking turns speaking through his body. Every voice possessed its own rhythm, its own emotion, its own terrifying identity. No human should have been capable of changing voices that perfectly. I remained hidden behind the tree, barely daring to breathe. I didn't want him to know I was there. I didn't even want to exist in that moment. Then everything stopped. Complete silence. For several long seconds, Hector stood perfectly still, his head slowly tilted, not toward the voices, toward me. Without turning around, without any possible way of seeing me, a deep voice emerged from him, calm, cold, and filled with unmistakable malice. "He's hiding behind the tree." A pause. Then another voice answered through the same mouth. This time, the voice smiled before finishing the sentence. "Don't let him get away." The instant Hector's eyes locked onto mine, every instinct inside me screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. Until that moment, no matter how strange he had been, there had always been an odd innocence about him. He wandered the streets with his childish skipping, smiled at invisible companions, and mumbled conversations that no one else could hear. He was unsettling, but never truly frightening. What I saw now was completely different. The expression staring back at me wasn't confusion. It wasn't madness. It was pure, concentrated hatred. His face twisted into something almost inhuman. His jaw clenched so tightly that I thought his teeth might shatter. The muscles in his neck bulged beneath his dirty skin, and his eyes, they weren't simply angry. They looked hungry. Not the hunger of someone wanting food. The hunger of someone who had finally found exactly what they had been searching for. For a split second, neither of us moved. The entire forest seemed to stop breathing. The wind disappeared. The birds fell silent. Even the trees felt unnaturally still. Then Hector smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the slow, terrifying grin of someone who knew a secret you desperately wished you didn't. I instinctively stepped backward. That tiny movement was all it took. Without warning, Hector exploded into motion. He let out a deafening scream that echoed through the forest like an animal being tortured, and he launched himself directly toward me. Gone was the bizarre skipping that everyone in town laughed about. Gone was the harmless drifter. He sprinted with terrifying speed. His feet pounded against the forest floor with unbelievable force, weaving effortlessly between trees as though he had spent his entire life hunting through those woods. I turned and ran. Branches whipped across my face. Roots reached out from the ground like invisible hands, trying to trip me. Every desperate breath burned inside my lungs. Behind me, Hector never stopped screaming. "You aren't leaving." His voice crashed through the trees. "You're going to die out here." Seconds later, that horrifying scream transformed into uncontrollable laughter. Not ordinary laughter. It sounded broken, twisted, like several people were laughing at once from inside the same throat. Then silence. Then another scream. Then laughter again. The sounds bounced between the trees, making it impossible to tell where he actually was. Sometimes he sounded only inches behind me. Other times his voice echoed somewhere far ahead. It felt as though the forest itself had joined the hunt. I didn't dare look back. Every horror story I'd ever heard warned against looking over your shoulder while something chased you through the woods. I don't know if that's superstition or survival instinct. I wasn't willing to find out. I simply ran. The forest became an endless blur of shadows, fallen logs, jagged rocks, and towering pines. My heart hammered so violently that I thought it might burst. My legs screamed in pain. Still, I kept running. Then, everything stopped. No footsteps. No screaming. No laughter. Nothing. The silence was somehow even worse. I slowed only enough to listen. Nothing. No birds. No wind. No movement. Just an impossible silence pressing against my ears. I forced myself to keep moving until I finally burst out of the dense woods and reached the dirt road where I had parked my truck hours earlier. Only then did I collapse against the driver's door, desperately scanning the tree line. Every shadow looked like a person. Every branch looked like an outstretched arm. But Hector was gone. Completely gone. As if the forest had swallowed him whole. I wasted no time driving back into town. My hands shook so violently that I nearly missed a turn on the way to the sheriff's office. When I stumbled through the front door, covered in sweat, dirt, and scratches, the sheriff immediately knew something was wrong. I told her everything. Every detail. The voices. The confrontation. The chase. The threats. At first, disbelief spread across her face. "Hector," she repeated quietly. No, not Hector. She had known him for years. Everyone had. To them, he was simply the strange man who wandered the streets talking to invisible people. Violent. That didn't fit the image anyone had of him. Then I described exactly where the encounter had happened. The effect on her was immediate. The color drained from her face so quickly it genuinely frightened me. For several seconds, she simply stared at the map hanging on the wall behind me. When she finally spoke, her voice had become noticeably quieter. "Are you absolutely certain that's where you were?" I pointed directly to the location. She slowly lowered herself into her chair. "You probably don't know this," she whispered, "but years ago, that's where we found someone." I felt my stomach tighten. She explained that many years before I ever moved into town, one of the local residents had disappeared without explanation. Weeks later, search crews discovered his remains deep inside those same woods, almost exactly where I had seen Hector. The murder devastated the entire community. Nothing like that had ever happened there before. The victim had been well known, well liked. The entire town attended the funeral. Despite months of searching, interviewing, and following every lead, they had investigators never identified a killer. Eventually, The case simply went cold. The sheriff leaned back, staring into space. Then she quietly said something that made my blood run cold. I've never really thought about it before. She paused. But I think Hector started showing up around the same time. Neither of us spoke. The coincidence hung heavily between us. She admitted her memory wasn't perfect after so many years, but the timeline seemed disturbingly close. Close enough to make her wonder whether everyone had overlooked the one person who never quite belonged. Within minutes, she grabbed her gear and asked me to take her back. Even if Hector had nothing to do with the old murder, attacking someone in the woods was more than enough reason to question him. We returned as quickly as we could. The hike felt different this time. Every step carried a growing sense of dread. When we finally reached the clearing, my chest tightened. It was exactly where I remembered. The same trees, the same moss-covered rocks, the same eerie silence. But Hector had vanished. There wasn't a footprint, not a broken branch, not a single sign that another human being had ever been there. The sheriff slowly walked through the clearing. Her face became increasingly pale. Finally, she stopped beside a patch of uneven ground. This, she swallowed hard. This is almost exactly where we found the body. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The forest remained perfectly still, almost as though it were listening. An extensive search followed over the next several days. Deputies searched trails. Volunteers combed through miles of woodland. Nearby towns were contacted. No one found Hector. No one saw him leaving. No one reported seeing him anywhere ever again. It was as if he had dissolved into the wilderness. Or, perhaps, he had never truly belonged to the town at all. Years have passed since that terrifying afternoon. I still hike those forests. They're still the most beautiful places I've ever seen. But beauty and fear have a strange way of existing side by side. Now, every time I disappear beneath those towering trees, I catch myself listening. Sometimes the wind brushing through the branches sounds eerily like distant laughter. Sometimes a snapping twig makes my heart stop. Sometimes I find myself glancing over my shoulder for no reason at all. I always carry the same folding knife clipped inside my pocket. Realistically, I know it probably wouldn't help much if Hector ever came charging out of the trees again. Maybe carrying it is more about comforting myself than protecting myself. To this day, I don't know whether Hector murdered that missing man. There was never enough evidence to prove anything. Only questions. Only coincidences. Only one horrifying encounter that no one else witnessed. But after seeing the rage that consumed him in those woods, after hearing voices that could not possibly have belonged to a single human being, after watching him disappear without leaving behind a single trace, I could no longer dismiss the possibility that something unspeakably evil was hiding beneath the harmless mask the entire town had accepted for years. Sometimes the greatest monsters don't announce themselves with blood or violence. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they skip down quiet streets. And sometimes they patiently wait until you're alone in the forest before showing you who they really are. Even now, after forcing myself to relive every second of what happened, I still struggle to believe it actually took place. Writing these words doesn't make the memories feel any less real. If anything, putting them on paper only drags me back into those mountains where every whisper, every shadow, and every unexplained sound still echoes in my mind. I've replayed those nights hundreds of times. Each time I reach a different conclusion. Sometimes I convince myself there has to be a logical explanation. Other times, I'm not so sure. If there's one lesson I've taken from this experience, it's this. Never assume that danger announces itself. Sometimes evil doesn't arrive with violence or obvious threats. Sometimes it waits patiently in complete silence, watching from somewhere just beyond the trees until you're isolated enough to hear it calling your name. I'm writing this while every detail is still painfully fresh because I'm terrified that with time my own mind will begin convincing me none of it happened. 3 days ago, my girlfriend Katie and I returned from what was supposed to be the most relaxing hiking trip we'd planned all year. Instead, we came home carrying questions neither of us can answer. Questions I honestly don't think anyone can answer. The trip had been planned for months. 4 days. 3 nights. Deep in the mountains of upstate New York. People who have never visited that part of the state usually imagine New York as nothing more than crowded streets, towering skyscrapers, flashing lights, and endless traffic. They're wrong. Once you leave the city behind, New York transforms into something entirely different. Ancient forests stretch for miles without interruption. Jagged mountain ridges disappear into the clouds. Crystal clear lakes reflect entire landscapes like mirrors. The silence is almost sacred. It's the kind of place that makes civilization feel like another planet. Katie and I had spent years exploring wilderness across the country. National parks, remote forests, high mountain trails. Camping had become part of who we were. Neither of us were inexperienced. Neither of us were careless. This trip should have been no different. The first day unfolded almost perfectly. A few brief rain showers cooled the air, leaving the forest smelling wonderfully of wet pine and rich earth. We laughed, took photographs, cooked dinner over a small camp stove. As darkness settled between the trees, we crawled into our tent, exhausted but happy. We planned to wake before sunrise and cover the longest section of the trail the following morning. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt wrong. At least, not until sometime after midnight. I don't know exactly what woke me. When I opened my eyes, I noticed Katie sitting upright beside me. Moonlight filtering through the fabric of the tent barely illuminated her face, but I could immediately tell something was terribly wrong. She wasn't simply awake. She was frozen. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes were locked on the tent wall as though she could see something standing just outside. "Katie." My voice sounded unnaturally loud. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she swallowed hard, glanced toward me, then looked back at the tent wall. When she finally spoke, her words came out unevenly. "I heard something." "What?" "I don't know." Her voice trembled. "But there's someone outside." My first thought was a deer. The mountains were full of wildlife. I've heard deer, coyotes, foxes, even bears moving through campsites before. Animals often investigate tents out of curiosity, but Katie knew the difference. She had spent countless nights camping beside me. Whatever she'd heard had frightened her in a way I'd never seen before. Trying to reassure both of us, I quietly reached for the tent zipper. "I'll just take a quick look." Before my fingers touched it, Katie grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. "Don't." She almost whispered the word. "No matter what you hear, don't open it." The fear in her voice immediately erased every rational explanation I'd been clinging to. I looked at her. She looked back at me. Neither of us moved. Then we both heard it. Crunch. A slow footstep outside. Then another. Whoever or whatever was outside wasn't simply passing through. The footsteps circled the tent. Slowly. Methodically. One complete circle. Then another. Then another. Each step was deliberate. Heavy enough to belong to a person. Far too controlled to be any animal. The footsteps never rushed. They never stumbled. They simply continued orbiting us like a predator studying trapped prey. Neither of us dared breathe. Every few minutes, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence followed. Then, from somewhere only a few feet away, a woman's laugh. High-pitched, soft, almost playful. It wasn't loud enough to sound threatening. That somehow made it infinitely worse. The laugh didn't belong in those woods. It sounded completely out of place. Almost inviting. Then the footsteps resumed. Circle after circle. Hour after hour. We whispered back and forth, desperately trying to decide what to do. Should we yell? Should we call for help? Should we run? Every option felt equally dangerous. Eventually, we decided the safest thing was also the hardest thing. Do nothing. Stay silent. Wait for daylight. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The laughter disappeared. The forest returned to complete silence. Normally, the peaceful sounds of the wilderness helped me sleep. That night, the silence felt alive. It pressed against the tent like another unseen presence. Neither of us slept again. At first light, I finally gathered enough courage to unzip the tent. I stepped outside, slowly scanning every direction. Nothing. No people. No footprints I could immediately recognize. No movement. Only towering pines standing silently beneath the pale morning sky. Relief washed over me. For about 5 seconds. Then I looked down. Scattered across our campsite were dozens of rocks. Not random rocks. They had been carefully arranged. Some were stacked into small towers. Others formed rough circles around our tent. Several had been placed in perfectly straight lines pointing directly toward the entrance. I knew with absolute certainty those stones hadn't been there the night before. Someone had spent hours arranging them while we sat trapped inside. Katie's face immediately drained of color. She wanted to leave. Right then. Immediately. Looking back now, I wish I'd listened. Instead, I convinced both of us that someone had simply been playing an incredibly cruel prank. There had to be a rational explanation. There always is. Right. We continued hiking, but something had changed. Katie kept glancing over her shoulder every few minutes. Several times she suddenly stopped walking altogether. Did you hear that? Every single time, I heard nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No movement. Still, the uncomfortable feeling refused to leave. The deeper we ventured into the mountains, the stronger it became. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, not by hikers, not by wildlife, by something quietly matching our pace from somewhere just beyond the trees. We cut the day's hike short. Katie couldn't enjoy the trip anymore. Neither could I, although I stubbornly refused to admit it. As darkness approached, we pitched our tent again. While cooking dinner, Katie finally looked at me and quietly said, "I don't want another night here." She begged me to turn back at sunrise. If we leave early enough, we can make it back before dark. I agreed. The adventure wasn't worth whatever was happening out there. That evening, exhaustion finally overtook Katie. Within minutes of climbing into her sleeping bag, she drifted into a deep sleep. I wasn't so lucky. Every tiny sound kept me awake. The wind, the trees, my own heartbeat. Eventually, sometime after midnight, I felt myself beginning to drift off. That's when I heard it, a whisper. So faint I almost believed I'd imagined it. My eyes flew open. I turned toward Katie. She hadn't moved, still asleep. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time. A soft female voice only inches beyond the thin fabric separating us from the darkness. "Come outside, Artie." Every muscle in my body locked. I hadn't told anyone we were camping there. No one should have known my name. Before I could process what I'd heard, another woman's voice joined the first. Gentle, almost affectionate. "Please, Artie, we're waiting for you." Cold spread through my entire body. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I barely allowed myself to breathe. Part of me wanted to wake Katie. Another part feared making any sound at all. Several agonizing seconds passed. The whispers stopped. For one brief moment, I foolishly believed it was over. Then footsteps exploded around the tent. Not walking, running, multiple sets. Fast, they circled us at impossible speed, crashing through leaves and snapping twigs with frantic energy. One runner became two became three, then four. Or maybe there had only ever been one. The sounds moved too quickly to count. As they raced around us, laughter erupted from every direction. High, shrill, wild. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was the laughter of something that had found exactly what it wanted. The tent walls trembled as unseen figures rushed past only inches away. Round and round they went, never slowing, never stopping, only laughing, as though whatever waited outside already knew one terrifying truth. Sooner or later, one of us would open that zipper. The laughter only grew worse. At first it sounded like ordinary giggling, the kind you might hear from a group of young women sharing some private joke. But the longer it continued, the more unnatural it became. It twisted into something else, something darker. The voices rose and fell together in shrill, broken bursts that echoed through the trees from every direction at once. They weren't laughing because something was funny. They were laughing because they were enjoying our fear. It wasn't human laughter anymore. It was the sound of predators entertaining themselves before the hunt. Every shriek bounced between the pines until it became impossible to tell how many of them were outside. There could have been 2 or 20. The forest itself seemed to amplify every sound, turning the darkness into a living thing. Then, without warning, every laugh stopped. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. A single voice suddenly cut through the darkness. It was no longer soft or playful. It had transformed into something impossibly deep, carrying a raw authority that vibrated through the ground beneath us. "Come outside." The command echoed between the trees. Then louder. "Come outside. Now." The force behind those words jolted Katie awake. She sat upright so violently that she nearly struck her head against the tent poles. For several seconds, she couldn't even understand where she was. Her eyes darted wildly around the tent while the laughter erupted again outside. "What is that?" Her voice cracked. "What's happening?" I opened my mouth to explain, but I never had the chance. Something slammed against the side of the tent. The entire shelter bent inward until the nylon fabric nearly touched our faces. Then another impact, another side, then another. It was as if several people had surrounded us and were deliberately throwing their full weight against the tent. The poles groaned. The rainfly snapped violently. The floor shifted beneath us. Then I felt something that froze every drop of blood in my body. The tent moved, not just shaking, moving. The entire tent slid several inches across the forest floor. Someone or several people were actually dragging us. Katie screamed. I grabbed one of the tent poles instinctively, although I had no idea why. It wasn't going to stop whoever or whatever was outside. The laughter became hysterical. It circled us from every direction, sometimes directly beside my ear, sometimes 20 yards away, then suddenly behind us again. It sounded impossible. No group of people could move that quickly through dense woods without stumbling or breaking branches. Yet whoever surrounded us ran effortlessly through the darkness. The voices overlapped until they became one horrifying chorus. Some laughed, some whispered, some simply breathed against the tent walls. I had spent years hiking remote wilderness. I'd encountered bears, coyotes, wild boars, violent storms. None of those experiences prepared me for the helpless terror of sitting inside a thin sheet of nylon while unseen figures played with us like toys. I realized something terrifying. I had absolutely no plan. If they cut through the tent, if they came inside, if they simply kept dragging us deeper into the forest, there was nothing I could do. For the first time in my life, I experienced pure, paralyzing fear. Not fear of dying, fear of not understanding what was happening. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything stopped. The footsteps, the laughter, the impacts. Absolute silence returned. Several sets of footsteps raced away through the woods. The sounds grew farther and farther until they disappeared completely. Neither Katie nor I moved. Neither of us spoke. The silence inside the tent became almost unbearable. 30 minutes passed, or maybe an hour. Time had stopped meaning anything. We simply stared at one another, searching each other's faces for some explanation neither of us possessed. Eventually I whispered, "I think they're gone." Katie didn't answer. She only gripped my arm tighter. Every instinct told me not to unzip the tent, but another part of me couldn't stand not knowing what waited outside. Very slowly, I reached for the zipper. The sound of it opening seemed deafening. Only a few inches, just enough to look through. I wish I hadn't. Roughly 20 feet from our campsite stood a young woman. She couldn't have been older than 25. She wore an impossibly clean white dress that seemed to glow beneath the moonlight. She wasn't hiding behind a tree. She wasn't trying to sneak closer. She was simply standing there, waiting, as though she already knew the exact moment I would look outside. She stared directly into my eyes. Then she smiled. Not a wide smile, not a threatening smile, just a calm, patient smile, the kind someone gives an old friend. Slowly, she lifted one hand and waved. The gesture was so gentle, so ordinary, that somehow it became infinitely more terrifying. Every instinct inside me screamed that if I looked at her 1 second longer, something irreversible would happen. I slammed the zipper shut. For several moments I couldn't speak. Katie looked at my face before quietly asking, "What did you see?" I didn't answer. She carefully leaned forward and opened the zipper just enough to see for herself. Only a second later she closed it again. Neither of us had to say anything. We had seen the same woman. The rest of that night felt endless. We sat back-to-back, arms wrapped around one another, listening for the slightest sound. Every few minutes I expected fingernails to scrape across the tent, or the zipper to slowly begin opening by itself, or that smiling woman to suddenly throw herself against the fabric. None of it happened. That somehow frightened me even more. Whoever or whatever had been outside no longer needed to scare us. It already had. At dawn, I forced myself to unzip the tent once more. The woman had vanished. The woods appeared completely normal. Morning sunlight filtered peacefully through the trees. Birds sang. A gentle breeze carried the smell of pine. Everything looked exactly as it should have, except our campsite. The rocks had returned. This time there were even more of them. Dozens of carefully balanced stone stacks surrounded the tent. Perfect circles. Perfect lines. Patterns that looked intentional but completely unfamiliar, as if someone had written a message in a language neither of us understood. Then we noticed the sticks. Bundles of branches had been tied together with strips of bark. Some formed twisted geometric symbols. Others resembled crude figures standing upright in the dirt. Katie crouched beside one. I've never seen anything like this. Neither had I. I considered photographing them. Instead, every survival instinct told me the same thing. Leave. Don't touch anything. Don't take anything. Don't even try to understand it. We packed our gear in complete silence. Neither of us spoke while breaking camp. We left every rock exactly where it was. Every strange symbol. Every woven stick. Whatever they meant. We wanted no part of them. The hike back barely felt like hiking. It felt like escaping. Every snapped twig behind us made us spin around. Every gust of wind sounded like distant laughter. Neither of us stopped until we reached the trailhead. When our car finally came into view, I experienced relief unlike anything I'd ever felt. We drove home almost without speaking. The mountains slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. Neither of us looked back. Even today, I still search for logical explanations. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. Maybe a group of people had secretly followed us. Maybe exhaustion distorted our senses. Maybe fear amplified ordinary events into something supernatural. Those explanations comfort me, until I remember one detail. No one knew where we were camping. No one knew my name. Yet something outside that tent whispered it as though we'd known each other for years. That single memory refuses to fit inside any logical explanation. Sometimes I think it's better not to know, because if there truly was something waiting for us beyond the firelight that night, then we were unbelievably lucky it only wanted us to listen. Years passed before I ever considered telling anyone that story. For a long time I convinced myself silence was easier. Not because I feared people wouldn't believe me, because I wasn't sure I believed myself. Eventually, life returned to normal, or at least it tried to. Every year since graduating high school, my closest friends, Theo, Carlos, and I have honored a tradition we've never broken. No matter where work, marriage, or family takes us, we disappear into the wilderness together for one weekend every year. When we were teenagers, those trips were fueled by curiosity. We explored abandoned logging roads, forgotten trails, and hidden valleys simply to see what we could find. Our greatest obsession, however, was caves. There was something irresistible about discovering places untouched by sunlight. By 16, we'd already found our first cave. Over the following years, we searched relentlessly for more. In truth, we only discovered 3 or 4 worthwhile caves, but the search itself became part of the adventure. As adults, those expeditions became less about exploration and more about preserving our friendship. The wilderness gave us a chance to forget careers, bills, responsibilities, and simply become teenagers again. We had encountered plenty of strange sights over the years. Once we stumbled across a massive clearing hidden deep inside the forest. Dozens of crude wooden huts surrounded towering piles of rusted metal, broken furniture, faded circus posters, and mountains of rotting debris. For several terrifying minutes, we thought we'd discovered some abandoned cult settlement. Later, we learned it had once housed workers from a traveling circus that had camped there decades earlier. The mystery had an ordinary explanation. Most strange things eventually do. So when we discovered an isolated cabin miles from the nearest trail during one of our annual trips, curiosity outweighed caution. It stood alone beneath towering pines, weathered by decades of wind and rain. The roof sagged. Several windows were shattered. The porch leaned dangerously to one side. It looked exactly like the sort of place every horror movie tells you never to enter. Naturally, we laughed. Carlos grinned and announced, "This is where everyone dies in the movie." Theo rolled his eyes. I laughed with them. At the time, none of us realized how frightening that joke would eventually become. Peering through the cracked windows, the cabin appeared abandoned. Only a few broken chairs, a collapsed table, and fragments of ruined furniture remained inside. Nothing moved. No lights. No footprints. No signs of recent visitors. Entering seemed harmless. After all, abandoned structures weren't unusual in remote forests. Over the years, we'd investigated countless forgotten places without incident. We stepped through the doorway expecting another interesting piece of local history. The moment my boots crossed the threshold, however, questions began forming in my mind. Not about who had lived there, but about why they had left in such a hurry. The first question that immediately entered my mind was painfully simple. Why would anyone build a cabin this deep in the wilderness? The farther I thought about it, the less sense it made. Calling it a cabin was actually being generous. It was little more than a large wooden shack crudely assembled from rough-cut timber that had long since surrendered to years of rain, snow, and neglect. The walls leaned ever so slightly, the roof sagged under its own weight, and every gust of wind made the entire structure groan like something struggling to stay alive. There were no windows with intact glass, no chimney, no plumbing, no electricity, no fireplace. Most disturbing of all, there wasn't even the faintest sign that a road had ever existed. No tire tracks, no overgrown trail, nothing. Someone had gone to tremendous effort to build this place in a location that seemed almost impossible to reach, only to abandon it completely. That realization alone felt wrong. The cabin consisted of only a single room, empty.
Silent.
Almost painfully ordinary. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt something I still can't fully explain. The air was unnaturally dry. Not dusty. Dry. Every breath scraped the back of my throat as if the room itself were slowly pulling moisture from my lungs. The silence inside also felt strangely compressed. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort you. It presses against your ears until you become painfully aware of your own heartbeat. Carlos wandered around the room, kicking through shattered furniture and broken shelves, hoping to find something interesting. Old tools, a newspaper, anything. There was nothing, just rotten wood collapsing into itself. Theo remained near the doorway. Something about the place clearly unsettled him, although none of us admitted it aloud. We joked. We laughed. That's what people do when they're trying to convince themselves they aren't uncomfortable. Then, we heard it. At first, I couldn't identify the sound. It was faint, slow, rhythmic. Skr. Pause. Skr. Pause. It sounded like something heavy dragging slowly across dirt. Not wood. Not concrete. Earth. The three of us stopped talking simultaneously. The sound continued. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was beneath us. Every instinct told me that shouldn't have been possible. The cabin wasn't built over a visible basement. There wasn't any cellar entrance. No crawlspace. Nothing. I slowly knelt and pressed my ear against the weathered floorboards. The instant my ear touched the wood, the sound became unmistakable. Something was moving directly underneath us, dragging, slowly, patiently, back and forth. The vibrations traveled through the floor. Whatever made them wasn't small. I stood up immediately. Without saying a word, I began pushing aside broken furniture, rotten planks, and years of accumulated debris. Dust exploded into the air with every movement. After several minutes of searching, something metallic caught my flashlight, buried beneath layers of dirt and splintered wood. A rusted iron handle, embedded directly into the floor. None of us spoke. We simply stared at it. Every horror movie I'd ever watched flashed through my mind. Every instinct told me to leave. Instead, curiosity won. It always does. Gripping the handle with both hands, I pulled. The wooden hatch resisted at first. Then with a violent crack, it swung upward. A wave of air burst from the darkness below. The smell hit me instantly. It was so overwhelming that I staggered backward. Rotting meat, wet decay, something sour, something ancient. It wasn't simply unpleasant. It smelled like death had been trapped beneath that cabin for years. My stomach lurched violently. I nearly vomited right there. Digging through my backpack with shaking hands, I wrapped a bandana tightly across my mouth and nose. It barely helped. The odor still clawed its way through the fabric. Holding my flashlight over the opening, I tried looking into the darkness. Nothing. The beam disappeared into blackness. Then skrr. The dragging sound came again. Louder now. There was no doubt anymore. Whatever had been making that noise was directly beneath us. Against every ounce of common sense, I began climbing down the old wooden ladder. Each rung creaked beneath my weight. The temperature dropped immediately. Not gradually. Instantly. 1 second I was standing in warm afternoon air. The next, it felt like I had stepped into the inside of a freezer. The cold wasn't natural. It wrapped around my body with suffocating intensity. Every breath escaped my mouth in pale clouds. Goosebumps covered my arms. When my boots finally touched the ground, I swept my flashlight around the room. The basement was surprisingly large. Its floor wasn't wooden. It was solid stone packed with damp earth. The walls disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of my light. Only 2 enormous support beams rose from the floor to the ceiling like ancient pillars holding the cabin above. Everything else was empty, or so I thought. Carlos called down from above. "Do you see anything?" I opened my mouth to answer. No. But the word never came. Movement. Slow. Painfully slow. From behind one of the massive wooden beams, someone emerged. At first glance, he looked completely ordinary. A man in his 30s, maybe early 40s. Messy, dark hair. Clean-shaven face. A faded green t-shirt. Old blue jeans. If I'd seen him walking down a grocery store aisle, I wouldn't have looked twice. Except he limped. His right leg dragged heavily across the stone floor. Skr. Step, skr. Step. The exact sound we'd been hearing upstairs. My heart nearly stopped. The noise echoed through the underground chamber with unnatural clarity. I gasped so violently that it barely resembled a scream. The man never reacted. Not even slightly. He simply continued dragging his foot from one side of the room toward the other. His breathing sounded labored. Each inhale rattled. Each exhale whistled through his chest, as though every breath caused him unbearable pain. Sir, my own voice sounded tiny beneath the cabin. "Are you okay?" Nothing. No response. Not even a glance. Above me, Carlos suddenly shouted, "Leave him alone." Theo had climbed halfway down the ladder. The moment he spotted the man, he froze without saying a word. He climbed right back out. I couldn't blame him. Every instinct screamed that something about this wasn't right. Still, Part of me refused to believe someone might genuinely need help. I stepped closer, just a few feet, close enough to hear that the man was quietly speaking, at least. I think he was speaking. The sounds didn't resemble English, or Spanish, or any language I'd ever heard. The words flowed together in low whispers that seemed almost impossible for a human mouth to produce. The hairs on my neck stood upright. Then, the man stopped walking, completely. Silence filled the room. His dragging foot froze. His breathing ceased. Even the whispering stopped. For several endless seconds, nothing moved. Then, without turning his shoulders, without shifting the rest of his body, his head slowly rotated toward me. The motion looked disturbingly unnatural, far too slow, far too controlled. His eyes met mine. They were completely expressionless. Not angry, not frightened, just empty. A second later, the rest of his body slowly turned to face me. Now he stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. The temperatures somehow felt even colder. Every instinct inside me screamed the same command: leave. Now I slowly took one cautious step backward, then another. The man didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't speak. He simply stared, never breaking eye contact. I continued retreating until my hand found the ladder behind me. The instant my fingers wrapped around the wooden rung, he moved. Only once. One slow, deliberate step toward me. Skrrr. Then he stopped again. That single step shattered whatever courage I had left. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't rushed. It felt intentional, like a hunter allowing frightened prey just enough hope to begin running. Adrenaline exploded through my body. I grabbed the ladder with both hands and climbed faster than I ever thought possible. The old wood groaned beneath my weight. Every second I expected to feel cold fingers wrap around my ankle. Every second I imagined hearing another slow skrrr directly beneath me. I never looked down. To this day, I'm grateful I didn't. The moment I reached the top of the ladder, I didn't hesitate. Every instinct I possessed, every survival reflex buried deep inside me was screaming the same command: get out. Now, I grabbed Carlos by the shoulder before he could ask another question. We have to leave. My voice barely sounded like my own. There is something seriously wrong down there. Neither of them argued. They had seen enough from my expression alone to understand that whatever I had witnessed beneath the cabin wasn't something I could explain with words. Still, curiosity has a dangerous way of surviving even after fear takes hold. Before we turned to run, the three of us looked down through the open trapdoor one final time. I wish we hadn't. At the bottom of the ladder, he was waiting. The man hadn't wandered away. He hadn't hidden. He had quietly walked directly beneath the opening and was standing perfectly still, looking straight up at us. The flashlight I had dropped below cast an eerie glow across his face, illuminating hollow eyes that seemed almost devoid of life. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't breathing. At least, not that we could see. One pale hand rested lightly against the side of the ladder, not gripping it, just touching it, as though he was calmly deciding whether or not to climb after us. The image froze every muscle in my body. There was no anger in his face, no desperation, no plea for help, only complete unnatural stillness. Somehow that terrified me far more than if he had been screaming. I'll never forget those eyes. People often describe someone's eyes as empty. Those weren't empty. They looked abandoned, as though whatever humanity had once lived behind them had disappeared years earlier, leaving only something that remembered how to imitate a person. For several endless seconds, none of us moved. Neither did he. The silence between us felt unbearable. Then Carlos whispered only two words: "Run now." We didn't need to hear it twice. All three of us bolted from the cabin as though the entire forest had suddenly caught fire. Rotten floorboards cracked beneath our boots. The cabin door slammed against the wall behind us. Branches whipped across our faces as we sprinted through the trees without caring which direction we were going. No one looked back. No one spoke. All we could hear were our own frantic breaths and the pounding of our boots against the forest floor. Several times I imagined hearing footsteps behind us, slow dragging. Skrrr. Step skrrr. Step. Every time I risked a glance over my shoulder, there was nothing. Only endless trees swaying gently in the afternoon wind. Eventually, after what felt like hours, we stumbled back onto the trail. Only then did we finally stop running. We bent over, gasping for air. No one said a word. We simply stood there trying to convince ourselves that everything we'd just experienced had actually happened. On the drive home, a single thought kept returning. What if that man genuinely needed help? What if he had been trapped, injured, Mentally ill? Had we just abandoned someone who desperately needed rescuing? For a few minutes, guilt began replacing fear. Then I remembered his face, his silence, the way his head turned before the rest of his body followed, the way he stopped breathing the instant he noticed me, the way he silently placed one hand on the ladder without taking another step. No, something about that encounter refused to fit inside any ordinary explanation. I still struggle to describe why. It wasn't one specific detail. It was the overwhelming feeling that every instinct in my body recognized something my conscious mind couldn't understand. Sometimes your brain notices danger before it can explain it. This was one of those moments. After reaching town, we decided the responsible thing to do was notify local authorities. Regardless of how frightened we were, if someone really was living beneath that cabin, they deserved to be found. We carefully explained everything: the location, the hidden cellar, the strange smell, the limping man, the dragging sounds beneath the floor. To their credit, they took the report seriously. Within days, officers located the cabin. They searched every inch of it: the main room, the surrounding forest, the underground chamber. According to them, no one was there. Not a single person. No sleeping bag. No food. No clothing. No tools. No footprints. No indication that anyone had been living beneath that cabin. Nothing. The officers admitted they found the underground room exactly where we described it. But beyond that, there was almost nothing to investigate. Even the horrible odor we described had largely disappeared. They searched missing person records across nearby counties. No one matched the man's appearance. No family reported anyone missing. No photographs resembled him. It was as though the person we'd seen had never officially existed. One detective even admitted something that has stayed with me ever since. They couldn't explain the cabin itself. Historical property records showed almost nothing. No clear ownership. No documented construction. No reason for anyone to build such an isolated structure miles from the nearest road. It simply existed, like it had always been there, waiting. Years have passed since that afternoon. I've replayed every second countless times searching for a logical explanation. Maybe we'd frightened an injured squatter. Maybe fear distorted our memories. Maybe the darkness exaggerated ordinary details into something sinister. My rational mind desperately wants one of those explanations to be true, but another part of me refuses to believe them. There are moments in life when your instincts react before your thoughts ever catch up. That day beneath a cabin, every instinct I possessed told me one undeniable truth: we were not supposed to be there. We had crossed into a place that didn't belong to us. Whether that man was evil, whether he was merely broken, or whether he was something else entirely, I honestly don't know. Perhaps we were the intruders. Perhaps we invaded the only refuge he had left. I've considered that possibility many times, but whenever guilt begins creeping into my thoughts, another image immediately replaces it. Those eyes, motionless, watching, patiently waiting at the bottom of that ladder, not climbing, not speaking, almost as though he understood one terrifying certainty: sooner or later, someone always looks down. My friends and I still honor our tradition. Every year we disappear into the wilderness together. We still hike. We still camp beneath the stars. The forests never stopped calling to us, but they've never felt quite the same. Now, whenever we wander off established trails, an unspoken rule follows us. If one of us spots an abandoned building, no discussion, no curiosity, no exploration. We turn around immediately, because some mysteries don't want to be solved. Some places survive only because everyone who finds them has the good sense to walk away. And if someday I ever find another weather-beaten cabin standing alone in the middle of an endless forest, I won't slow down. I won't peek through the windows. I won't wonder who once lived there. I'll run in the opposite direction as fast as my legs can carry me. Because sometimes the greatest horror isn't discovering what's hidden inside. It's realizing something inside has already noticed you.